All right, nice to see you on this Father's Day, all the dads. Hopefully you had breakfast in bed and all the good stuff. So if not, maybe a midnight snack in bed, that would be pretty good. So our last message about from Ecclesiastes. Some of you are new here, so you don't know we're in the middle of a series on the book of Ecclesiastes, the oddest book in the Bible, and one of the best. It's one of a kind. So anyway, I hope you're enjoying this. I certainly am. But last time we were talking about injustice, and so we had a week gap here. And by the way, where are we going after this? Is there a problem? It's grumbling. Hello? This is bad. No. Okay. Well, forget what I was going to say before about what's coming after this. We used up all that time. No, actually, when we're done with Ecclesiastes, we're planning to do a series on the little books. So there's some little books of the New Testament. They're just one chapter long that we have never preached on in, 45 plus years. And so there's, which one they would be? Jude, 3rd and 2nd John, and then Philemon. So in August and September, we're going to be tackling those. And so if you're interested in that, you can come back for that. Oh, anyway, our last message was on injustice, and there's a weird thing about that. If you think about, there's a God in heaven, and there's stuff happening on earth that just doesn't fit what you would think God would want to happen. And you look at all that, and you wonder what God is up to. And then you think about, like, maybe you're like a kid who has a daddy who is a judge, and you're watching the news, and they're exposing, some verdict that was rendered that was just way too harsh, or one that was way too lenient, and you tend to just kind of wonder, what's my dad like? And then he comes home, and then you got to sit up on his lap and have a conversation with him. And how do you do that? It's perplexing to figure out how to have a relationship with a dad like that, who is maybe doing things that don't seem to make sense. And yet you trust him. You think that must be okay, but he doesn't really explain it all to you. And that's where we are. That's how it is with us and God. And knowing everything we know, we still come to him. In Ecclesiastes 5, now it's going to talk about worship and coming to him in a worshipful way. And so he talks about worship, and you kind of wonder if maybe he's thinking, wow, if you learn how to worship, you've got an unpredictable God, and you can come to him, and the way you pray to him and all that will get him to do what you want him to do that makes more sense. So we're going to try to understand worship a little bit. And when we say the word worship, then it brings up all kinds of mental associations you all have. If you grew up in church at all, you think about, hymnals and organs and dressing up in your Sunday best and trying to stay quiet in church, and all the little girls in my Sunday school class that had an autograph book. Did you have that? Every girl had an autograph book, and when a guest speaker would come, they'd have him sign it and give his life for. You had to have a life verse too, that you could sign in it. And if a missionary came, they'd have that, write that out. Anyone remember that? I'm really old, maybe, yeah. Yeah, and I probably went to a cult or something. Anyway, yes, whatever. So anyway, figure that out. Well, in this passage, we are warned from the very beginning of it to be careful when we come to worship God. We ought to be very interested in this question because the passage ends with the command to fear God. Fear God. And so that means that when we're talking about worship, we're talking about holy ground. In fact, there's a key word that I want us to think about, and it's the word reverence. Reverence. Now, we can think, and that's just a word for fear, but what does it really mean? Why do we say that instead of just fear? Well, John Calvin actually helped define this for us, and I love this definition. He says, reverence is the place where joy and fear are held together, not the fear of trembling and despair, but the kind that cultivates awe and respect when contemplating God's holiness, nearness, grace, and power. Now, we can stop and tease that out, but I want to set something straight at the beginning here because it's something that you're probably all aware of, that when we say fear God, we don't mean cower from him or be afraid of him in some way that, we need to run away, sort of like Adam and Eve in the garden when they didn't realize how to reverence God in this way. Tim Keller kind of writes about this, and he's trying to get across this same point as he discusses Calvin's rules of prayer. As he gets into that, he says, what then should a Christian be afraid of regarding God? Think of it like this. Imagine that you suddenly are introduced to some person you have always admired enormously, perhaps someone you have hero worshiped. You reach out to shake her hand, and suddenly it hits you. You can't believe you're actually meeting her. You discover to your embarrassment that you are trembling and sweating, and when you try to speak, you're out of breath. What is going on? You are not afraid of being hurt or punished. Rather, you are genuinely afraid of doing something stupid or saying something that is inappropriate to the person and the occasion. Your joyful admiration has a fearful aspect to it. You are in awe, and therefore you don't want to mess up. That is something we experience, even in the presence of an admirable human being. How much more is this a proper response to God? So the teacher here in Ecclesiastes 5 begins with, watch your steps when you enter God's house, God's holy presence. And by the end of this passage, you're going to be ready to answer some questions. What are some of the challenges and the possible missteps when we are coming into God's presence to worship him? And then what do we do about them? So we're going to try to work on that. So go with me in this, and this is going to it's going to fall off anyway, so here we go. All right, let's read it. Watch your steps when you enter God's house. And number one would be approach to listen rather than to offer sacrifices as foolish people do, people who don't know what they're doing, that they're doing anything wrong. Now, a couple of things come to mind immediately. This holy place, sort of like God's house. We know that Jesus kind of wiped out the distinction between holy and profane places, but there is still, when we come to God, there is that entrance into his holiness. But here it's probably talking about the temple. And when you were going to approach the temple, each step toward that most holy place had rules to it. It was controlled. It was who could approach and who could not approach and how you would do that. Even what you were wearing when you do that. And, but there was no fooling around. Just ask Uzzah about that. But Hebrews 12:28 puts this into the present age, where the writer says we must worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. So much of what we read here is going to be very perfectly applicable to the way we pray, the way we come to God and worship, even in this room. We come together, we're wanting to worship God. And I doubt you would be here this morning if that didn't interest you. The teacher starts out with a solemn warning. Be careful, watch your steps. You could fall on your face in a bad way as you take those last steps into, the temple. Guard your steps. And that would be us. And I mean, not just unorthodox, flighty people, just regular people like us. We should take this seriously. And sometimes I wonder, if I can interject this, that some of us tend to be way too casual about our worship. And I don't mean just style of worship. Let's say you want a more casual approach. But if that's the case, then you had better know there's a serious reason why you do it that way. In other words, we don't do it just unthinkingly. Solomon fastens on the priority of listening to God. And you might have in mind a worship that is more like bringing sacrifices. So let me put something up here. I don't even know what button to push now with my left hand. There we go. Let's go this way. I'll go back and forth. Somebody asked me last Sunday, why does your hand shake? I don't know. But anyway, evidently I had some kind of TIA or something in my old age, so I get a little bit of that old age shake, so you know I'm old. All right. The priority of listening. And now you might think, oh, sacrifices. And so what does he say here? Not to offer sacrifices as foolish people do. Now, at that time, they were supposed to bring sacrifices. So he's not denying the value of a sacrifice per se, but he's critiquing the way that somebody might come, using the rituals with, many words and all of that, but no awareness truly of God and a knowledge of God. So that's why you come to listen first. If Solomon was behind this writing at all, you've got to remember that he was the king that actually put up the temple, built the temple. He had made a huge investment of the ability of people to come and bring their sacrifices. And you might guess, but you would be wrong, that Solomon thought that the most important thing was performing the rituals. That, you could make God happy with you if you do these rituals. But no, stop. The first and foremost thing is to learn to listen to what God is already thinking before the sacrifice is made. It could be that he's already happy with you. So you can truly hear God's heart when you come to his word. So we're going to talk about the first act of true reverence. We have a seminar that I teach here at the 001 seminar on discovering worship. And one thing that I say in that, and this is there's a whole section called a response to revelation. That worship is responding to what God has told you. So frankly, if you want to get more and more worship in the church, you don't do a series on worship necessarily. You teach a series on Jesus and on the cross and on the great traits of God, or almost anything in the Bible that lets you know more of God and his heart. And so, Spurgeon said that he felt that the very large majority of churchgoers in his day were merely, quote, unthinking, slumbering worshipers to an unknown God. Now, you can't put worship and unknown God in the same sentence, really, except in the way that he did. We have to be so glad that's not true in our day, right? Well, do you want great worship feelings? See, this is what has generated a lot of stuff we have today. So you get a warm glow. You're sort of in love, sort of like you're in love with love when you just love to worship because it gets you these feelings that you really love. Sorry about moving the mic around all the time. I'm not used to doing this. John Fisher sounds a warning to any church that tries to create worship feelings through rituals and through kind of the way we do it. He says, when we admonish people to praise, don't tell them what they're going to get out of it or even what God will get out of it. Tell them to praise him simply because it is right and reasonable to do so for a God like this. To attach anything more to this is to presume undue importance upon ourselves. So, your quest in worship must not be using rituals to produce feelings. That's just going to open you up to manipulation and deception and trivialities. Your quest should be for the facts about God. You feed your soul the truth and the truth about God and his ways, and you connect with him. It's not what you want him to be like either, but how he wants to be known, and then you respond as honestly as possible to what you see. All right, so that's the priority of worship. Now, he goes on to talk. Well, he says something about sacrifices maybe being something that fools are taken into too much account. And we have passages in the Bible that help us understand this a little more. So I'm going to put a couple of these on the references up here, and you can write these references down. Psalm 51:16. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. This is David talking to God when he's doing that great confession after his great sin. He said, well, I can bring a sacrifice that would make you happy with me, but no, first of all, I need to repent before you as a living God. 1 Samuel 15:22 and 15:22. This is Samuel talking to Saul. To obey is better than sacrifice. To listen is better than the fat of rams. This is when the whole situation, I'm not going to describe it all, but Saul had come back from battle and he was supposed to wipe everything out, but he brought back a bunch of sheep and he says, oh, I brought him back for sacrifices. Really, he just brought him back to eat. But so he lies about it, but Samuel says, look, to obey, you didn't obey. That's better than sacrifice. To listen is better than the fat of rams. So rituals often are misconceived as a way of getting something from God, sort of like carrots to manipulate the Almighty, or, a little magic to loosen up the heavenly purse strings, or, a gift, which we call a bribe, for God not to punish us. There's another great passage on this. I won't read. Psalm 40, verses 6 to 8. So let's be honest about today's worship as we see it, even in non-liturgical settings like ours. If you attend a lot of contemporary worship, you're going to see people wanting to experience God, and they can be very sincere in that. A worship leader today is supposed to help you feel God's presence, teach you how to tap into God's blessings, but then it goes on. God is there to then fulfill your wishes if you leverage him by saying the right things, doing the right things that are part of your your group experience or from your traditions. What comes from, peer pressure, maybe sheer habit, or even from fear. So you say prayers with the right formulas, and you give offerings with the right amounts, and you sing songs with the right rhythms and maybe the repetitions, and then you can expect prosperity and health and prophecies and miracles of all kinds, and then you use the power of God to grow a big church and to fill people with the Holy Spirit and to lose weight and to find a spouse and cure cancer and win the lottery. Now, is that okay? No, that is not okay. That is not biblical worship. This is literally what it says here is the sacrifice of fools, often well-meaning, which is the issue here, because notice what he says, they don't know they're doing anything wrong. Because this is just really natural religion. Do you know anything about Baal worship? So I'm going to talk about Baal here a little bit, the Baal problem. And this would be from Numbers, write the reference down here first, Numbers 25. It's the first time Baal is mentioned in the Old Testament is when Israel is not quite to the promised land. They're out in the wilderness, and they come up across the nation of Moab. And they begin offering sacrifices to gods with those people, and they bow down. And it says in verse 3, so Israel yoked himself to Baal at Peor. Now, some of you pronounce it Baal, but Baal is the way we normally say it. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the result of that is that 24,000 people died in punishment from God. That's how much God hates Baal worship. So now let's talk about it. Because this was a religion that Israel habitually fell into. A religion of their neighbors that they also believed in God, but they had a totally opposite way of approaching him. And how is that different from one another? So let's put some things down here. The Baal problem, and the first one I want is this, and I'm not going to keep putting these up because you're going to try to write them down, and I want to say them faster than you can write. So let me just give you one, and you'll have time for this one. Baal worship employs God to fulfill your desires. Biblical worship employs you to fulfill God's desires. God's not looking for employment, all right? And by the way, worship and serving are actually the identical word, especially in the Greek. Now, Baal worship uses God as a magic wrench to make my kingdom work. Biblical worship volunteers myself as a homely earthen pot where God can make his kingdom work if and when he wants to. Baal worship is a way of getting. Biblical worship is a way of giving. Baal worship is twisting God. Biblical worship is trusting God. Baal worship was entirely subjective and experience related. Biblical worship is based on objective truth that stays truth whether I feel it or not. And so, by the way, back in the 80s, the book of choice was called Knowing God. By the late 90s, the book of choice was Experiencing God. Somehow, Baal kind of slipped into God's chair a little bit. Today it would be ignoring God. But anyway, Baal worship is the pursuit of sensory ecstasy. Biblical worship is the pursuit of God with or without feelings. Baal worship is all about me. What do I get out of this? Biblical worship is all about him. Was he pleased? Baal worship tries to coerce God to do something for you. Biblical worship celebrates God for the amazing stuff he has already done. Baal worship is me impressing God. Biblical worship is God impressing me. So, by the way, you don't enter because you're special, but because God is special. So it's not that you're especially good, it's that he is especially gracious. And that's the only way you get through the door. Baal worship is about me expressing myself. Biblical worship is about God expressing himself. And that's why Solomon says the first thing is here, when you want to go in carefully, you do so to listen first. you listen first in the presence of this real God. Baal worship is about making God respond to me. Biblical worship is about me finding an appropriate way to respond to God. Now, what Kohelet says here is roughly matching some insights from John Calvin. A lot of centuries later, what she called 4 rules of prayer, or worship, we could call it. And so we're going to go through some of these and kind of interweave these with what we're getting from Ecclesiastes. And the first rule is this: worship is reverent awareness of the one to whom we are speaking. So moved by God's majesty that freed from earthly cares and affections, they come to it meaning prayer. So they come to prayer with this understanding that God is amazing, and kind of our stuff and all of that sort of fades. In prayer, we must then, this is Calvin talking, be disposed in mind and heart as befits those who enter conversation with God. And just write God with very big letters. R.C. Sproul talks about this first rule. He says, Calvin wrote of how easy it is for our minds to wander in prayer. We become inattentive as if we were speaking to someone with whom we are easily bored. This insults the glory of God. And we should be deeply afraid of grieving him in such a way. And so we listen well first. So we need to talk about that more. Can you see how the Baal thing is kind of subtly replacing God in many circles? But people don't seem to notice that there's any change. It was the same in Solomon's day. Notice at the end of the verse how he puts it. People who don't know they're doing anything wrong. Because it was the natural thing to do, to think that, well, okay, God, so I bring sacrifices, I appease God to get his blessings and his protections and even his forgiveness. There is nothing of grace in it. It is somehow I'm coming in the right way, and then God is doing for me what I need him to do. And this is just sort of a mindless using of sacrifices as mechanical ways of making God look at me okay. And it's done all, I'll just call it all habit, no heart, or maybe all heart and no truth. Now, what does please God? And this is the beginning on your notes is really this is the heading. It's humbly hearing God's heart, that is better than piles of calculating sacrifices. God's heart, with the intent of believing, of course, and obeying what he says. Hearing in the Old Testament and New Testament has a concept of obeying what you hear. Now, what God wants is a sincere and open heart to him. He wants to give you something before he ever asks you to give him anything. He wants to give you truth. And so you listen to him. I mean, and that's why at FBC, from the first years that we met, we started with the preaching and we ended with the worship. And it was for this very reason, because we, first of all, want to hear what point God wants to make. And then we just want to respond to it honestly, reasonably. We inhale before we exhale. You've heard this before, probably, if you've been here around at all. And that's all part of what we often say. The focal point of worship is God, not you. So first of all, let's hear God. It's important to hear what he says before we concern ourselves what we have to say or what we have to sing or what we even have to pray. And so we should all be honest. Do we come to God maybe to salve our conscience or to drop in an offering to, bend God's will? Would we dare not tithe? This one woman told me one time, I have to tithe or God would punish me. Do you ever sing the worship songs mindlessly without considering their words? It might be the word you sing, I surrender all, but do you really? Are you really thinking about that? Or you come to church when things are shaky in your life and you need extra points with God, but then when things ease up and you're okay, then you quit coming. Or do you come here because God is magnificent and amazing and he deserves to be worshiped no matter what's happening in your life? So where's Solomon going with all of this? Well, this is just, it runs here right in the middle of Ecclesiastes. The big theme he's been trying to go through is the futility and the frustrations of life. And what he's thinking here is perhaps you could reduce some of that frustration by considering the serious demands of worship. Coming to learn from God, listening to him as you approach him. Well, the second challenge of true worship has to do with your prayers. Is it okay to just shoot off your mouth with God? Can you just say anything you want, anytime you want, any way you want? And the answer is no. So verse 2. Don't be so quick to speak, and don't let your heart blurt out some matter in front of God because he's in heaven and you're only here on earth. So keep it short. The busier you are, the more likely you are to have dreams, and I put in the word disturbing, because dreams can be used in different ways, but here it seems like uneasy dreams because you're just overworked. And the more you talk, the more likely you are to say something foolish. Now, this reminds us right away of something like James 1:19, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Or Proverbs 17, which says, whoever restrains his words has knowledge. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. So even in normal conversation, wouldn't we take into account who we're talking to before we open our big mouth? It's just common sense that you don't spill out your intimate secrets to the checker at Safeway with, 5 other strangers eagerly listening in. So before you pray, you take time to think about whom you're talking to. Sort of like don't be so quick means think before you speak. Restrain your speech until you can adjust your heart to the audience with a capital A, and then you will remember, as the teacher puts it, that he is in heaven and you're only here on earth. Now, what does he mean by that? He's in heaven, we're on earth. It doesn't mean he's indifferent and aloof. It just means he's different, that he's transcendently great in a way that we could hardly even imagine. The slightest thing about God is infinitely more impressive than the most impressive thing about you or me. Because whatever you have is going to have to be derived, a given. Whatever God has is his inherently. And the other thing is that there isn't anything slight about him. The slightest, there is no slight great thing about God. They're all great. And everything cool about you came from him. So let's just say God is in heaven, exalted and great beyond imagination, and I'm only here on earth. So when I come into his presence, keep it short. Keep it short and sweet, short and simple. What do you say? Bruce, what? I mean, this is, I thought we were supposed to pray without ceasing. And the longer the prayer, the better. I mean, I grew up on this book, The Power Through Prayer by E.M. Bounds. And this has whole chapters on guys that prayed 4 hours a day, and that was the big model. Of course, none of us could do that. So we always felt like total wimps when it comes to prayer. But then you read here, keep it short, and you're thinking, hey, my prayers are already brief because I'm so busy. And, and so now I don't feel so bad. I love this book. This author, this teacher dude, he is right on my wavelength there. Keep it short. This is the one command in the Bible about prayer that I've actually kept. Well, many of the greats would say, I'm so busy, I have to pray even more, and whatever. So let's not talk too much about length. I'll get one more comment on that. But don't use words to try to reprogram God. That's what the point is here. Your many words, somehow you're going to talk God into your thing. Like somehow my kids in the past, they say, if I can keep on Dad long enough, he'll do what I want him to do. You cannot use God like that. You can't work him. He won't be impressed with flowery language. By the way, he invented language. And he already knew the heart of your prayer before you had a word to give it expression. You look at Matthew 6, chapter 7, or verse 7 and 8. Jesus says that there's no need to babble on and on like the pagans do, who think that they'll be heard because of their many words. Remember this? And then he says, don't be like them, because your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Before you even say, he already knows the prayer. So why are you going on and on and on and think, I got to get 4 hours of prayer before I really, can be with the heroes of prayer. And then he says, immediately says, then pray like this. And then he gives us the model prayer. Now, the model prayer, sadly, is being used all across this world and has for centuries, just like the pagans do, said over and over again thoughtlessly. So that's totally ironic that he's giving it as a model of brief prayer. But anyway, humble sincerity is more important than any kind of eloquence you bring. Just get to the point. Remember how great God is, and it's a solemn thing to speak to him, even though By an amazing grace, he can actually be in this friend relationship with you. Nevertheless, you pray in awe, not with your mouth flapping. Remember part of the Lord's Prayer, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Set apart. Incredible difference, not indifference, difference between you and God. Now get this, we commonly think of prayer as improved by things like, and I was trying to make a list here, and I'm sure I didn't get them on, by its length, by its volume, by its vocabulary, by its position. You know, if I get down on my face or kneel, this makes it even better. Getting tons of people to pray, that would be multitudes, or fervency, or frequency. But prayer is not improved by any of those things. Why? Because they all imply that you are cajoling or coercing the Almighty. You are subtly or not so subtly trying to twist his arm to say yes to your request. You're filibustering God. There is not one thing you can ever do that counts enough to merit even one small blessing from God, including whatever you want to try to do in prayer. Don't filibuster God as if you can wear him down. Don't try to control God. Now, it's a whole other thing to let God twist your arm when you're praying. I mean, that's fine. He humbles you. He makes you submit to his sovereign, divine rights. Compare the simplicity and brevity of that model prayer in Matthew 6. Less than 50 words that say it all. Now, turn the page over in a little bit. Just say, don't go crazy on me. Does a prayer get holier as it gets shorter? Like say, I'm going to make it as short as possible. I'll just say, help. Then I'm done for the day. Actually, that is not a bad prayer. Help and thanks are probably the best prayers you can always say to God. But there is no point in counting words. That's not the point. What God wants is the sincerity and humility of your heart. And if it takes you 4 hours to be sincere and humble, then do it. Take 4 hours. Now let's go to Calvin's second rule of prayer. He says, and it's about heartfelt sense of need, with a sense of need that excludes all unrealities, such as forgetting we're not God, but are flawed and unworthy beggars. And so here's different ways you can talk about this. Prayer can be an exercise in blasphemy if we entreat his blessing for our sinful desires. Joel Beakey talks about all four of these rules, and he says about this, he says, Calvin does not mean that believers should pray for every whim that arises in their hearts, my needs, but that they must pray penitently in accord with God's will, keeping his glory in focus, yearning for every request, quote, with sincere affection of heart, and at the same time desiring to obtain it from him. It has to do with the reality of him and you. You come to him, he is a God, amazing, and you are maybe a pitiful petitioner. And you recognize that. Here's what reality sounds like. This is Francis Spufford, a British writer, who happened to be born the year I graduated from high school. So what does he have to say? Anyway, a lot. What we're talking about here is not just our tendency to lurch and stumble and screw up by accident, our passive role as agents of entropy. It's our active inclination to break stuff. Stuff here including promises, relationships we care about, and our own well-being and other people's. You are a being whose wants make no sense, don't harmonize, whose desires deep down are discordantly arranged so that you truly want to possess and you truly want not to possess at the very same time. You're equipped, you realize, more for farce than for happy endings. You're a human, and that's where we live, and that's our normal experience. Now, that is reality. When we come before God, that is the person that we are, that we must bring before him. So prayer, by the way, is not actually telling God what to do with his universe, as if we forget that he is in heaven and we are just here on earth. His vantage point is a lot better than ours. And I love the things that Jackie Hill Perry kind of makes us think about here. This vast difference. Here's how you get the kind of humility that worship requires. And I have a section of the quotes that I'm going to give you up here. Don't try to write these down, but here's what she says. She's studying holiness. Her book is called Holier Than Thou. As God, he is not dependent on his creation to do anything. He is distinct from it, and therefore he can never be controlled, challenged, or intimidated by it. If every sea in the world twisted itself into a hurricane tall enough to meet the clouds, wide enough to cover 1,000 cities, its knees would still bow and eventually break at God's command to be still. More than that, the sea couldn't twist into nothing anyway without his decree or permission, as if they had some ability to conspire against God or some inner life of their own apart from his word that holds them together. They cannot move 1 inch without him saying so or without his knowledge. Under his watchful eye and divine sovereignty, what can the world do to the God who formed it? God has no needs. The God who made the world, this is quoting from Paul in Acts 17, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. God's self-sufficiency means there is nothing lacking in God. He is immutably whole. If the rocks replaced the praise of millions who opted to withdraw their love or keep quiet their worship, it would not leave God empty, as if he needed our praise to be complete. If and when we imagine a God who needs us for anything, we are dreaming of an idol and not the I am who I am. Exodus 3:14. As incomparable as God is, it seems to me that one problem with us humans is that we become so used to the idea of God that we treat him as commonplace. I think that may be our default, however. Treating God like he's ordinary might be a natural response when we're ignorant to who God has revealed himself to be. Even with Moses, if he wasn't told to come near, this is at the burning bush, he would have come near. He had to be instructed on how to approach God, to not come too close, to remove his shoes and respect the sanctified ground underfoot. The same with Israel, who was warned not to touch the mountain God descended on, lest they be put to death following the irreverent approach. Devoid of awe, we reach behind the veil too quick to even notice the disrespect. We enter the Holy of Holies and treat the mercy seat like a footstool. Seeing him, Isaiah fell on his face in front of him. John fell at his feet like a body does once the soul leaves. The holy God is no regular being. And then she closes with this: don't let life get hard. You may be tempted to believe that God has changed because your circumstances have, but if that were the case, he wouldn't be God, he'd be you. There is no greater stability in all of the created universe except in God. Words like that gift us with the kind of humility that comes in the face of true sovereign glory. And so, think of it this way: you're living in a fantasy to think that many words are going to change God's plan for the universe. And now he's going to talk about life in a dream and whatever. So, some of this I'm going to have to go through more quickly, but let's do this. Let's emphasize verse 3 for a minute. The busier you are, the more likely you are to have bad dreams or disturbing dreams, and the more you talk, the more likely you are to say something foolish. So where does verse 3 fit in here? Well, it's very hard to interpret this verse. There's lots of different ways of approaching it. But I'm just going to say that basically he's comparing the life that we ought to have and the reality. Here's God, here's me, here's really God, and here's really me. And now we have dreams. You know, when you wake up from a dream, how you go through this deal. Like I have a deal where I am floating on a basketball court and I'm dunking the ball over and over, and I don't even have to come down to the floor. And when I wake up, I think it really happened. That's an amazing fantasy. Now, I love that, but you can't come to God with a fantasy like that. You can't come to God and more talk like a fool and just blurt out stuff. You know, you blurt out stuff and you say things to God when your plate is so full, you're full of your agenda and not his. And that's over busyness. The busier you are, the more likely you are to have those dreams. The more you're going to search in your mind even for some other reality. And so I want to talk a little bit. There's a verse in Proverbs 10:19, when words are many, sin is not absent. And that's actually true of sermons too, so when sermons get too long. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about hurry, about overwork, about filling your life in this, because I think this is so practical. This is something we all know about. Anyone here that does not struggle with kind of being overbooked, or, there's too many places to go and too many phone calls to make and too many letters to write and too many emails to answer and, this, that, and the other. Too many chores, too many unfinished projects, I'm sorry to remind you of all this. Anyway, I think about something written by Ronald Rolheiser, a Catholic theologian. He said, today, a number of historical circumstances are blindly flowing together and accidentally conspiring to produce a climate within which it is difficult not to just think about God or to pray, but simply to have any interior depth whatsoever. We, for every kind of reason, are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion. We are more busy than bad, more interested in the movie theater, the sports stadium, and the shopping mall, and the fantasy life they produce in us than we are in church. Pathological busyness, distraction, and restlessness are major blocks today within our spiritual lives. Now, I'm just halfway through a book by John Mark Comer called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Although I'm not sure I'll ever have time to finish it, but anyway. But why do we do this? Why do we get so busy? Because our whole culture has us going that way. We have to get our kids in all of the sports. We have to go to the limit on this, that, and the other. I mean, we could just go through a list. Corrie ten Boom once said this: if the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy. And there's truth in that. Both sin and busyness have the exact same effect. They cut off our connection to God, our access to people, the time even to nurse your own soul. And I wrote this down as I was thinking about this. I said, rushing around is a sign that we've got to make something successful of our lives, and that's the opposite of worship, which is all about resting and quiet and assurance of accomplished and promised stuff. The life of hurry is arrogantly assuming the universe will go sideways if we slow down. And the rush is killing our worship. It's killing our praying. It's killing our God-centeredness. It's a complete denial of Romans 12:1 and 2 that tells you to be a sacrifice, but come to God and don't be conformed to this world, which we do. Instead, we should be transformed by the renewing of our minds. That's listening to God. So I'm going to say to dads today, take the lead on this. Slow down and start saying no to the non-essentials for your family and begin seeing how you can make more time for what's truly important. Now, what's the teacher's second point here? Listen better is the first, which means listen more. And then talk better, which means talk less. And then here's how we say that one. Thoughtful brevity in prayer is better than an eloquent barrage of foolish words. Now, the teacher is going to speak of vows. And this will be a perfect example of, or a case of how many words can get you into trouble. So here we are now in verse 4. So, for example, now when you make God a vow,